why. Hopefully you have some idea of why you're coming to this town hall, and it's really so we can just kind of go over what we think the landscape is for exchange at the moment, and to talk about what might happen in the future. And the idea really is to just be as transparent as we can with you, give you as much information as we can so that you can make an informed decision. So this is really just about trying to help you make the decision that is right for you. So to begin, I want to acknowledge that Queens is situated on traditional Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee territory. We are all grateful to be able to live, learn and play on these lands. And Michael, Haley and I are coming to you today from Queens, from Kingston. I'm grateful to live as an uninvited guest upon the traditional territories of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy and the Anishinaabe Nation. And by acknowledging this traditional territory, I'm recognizing its longer history, one predating the establishment of the earliest European colonies. And it's also to acknowledge this territory's significance for the indigenous peoples who lived and continue to live upon it, and whose practices and spiritualities were tied to the land and continue to develop in relationship to the territory and its other inhabitants today. It's my understanding that this territory is included in the Dish with One Spoon, One From Belt Covenant, an agreement between the Iroquois Confederacy and the Confederacy of the Ojibwe and allied nations to peaceably share and care for the resources around the Great Lakes. The Kingston Indigenous community continues to reflect the area's Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee roots. And as many of you will know now, there is also a significant Métis community, as well as First Peoples from other nations across Turtle Island present here today. And I've been reflecting on that land acknowledgement, which is a fairly universal one that you may have heard before, and on a statement that was made in support for Indigenous students, staff and faculty a while ago, that each of us has a personal responsibility to nurture good relations with each other and with all Indigenous peoples and communities. And we've been invited to reflect on how we can approach our work and our relationships and actions at Queen's to ensure that they are anti-racist in practice. And I would invite you to think about how this extends beyond borders, beyond your locale, wherever you are, and if you are in Kingston, and how those commitments to peaceably sharing and caring for resources that you will be accessing when you are on exchange. And especially as some of you may be traveling as uninvited guests to places with Indigenous populations. So in today's town hall, we're going to cover a few things. Like I said, we're going to just go a little bit over the exchange program overview, just to kind of give you a bit of context for what we're working with. We're going to talk about what the potential disruptions could be, and this is based on what we've kind of observed over the past year, and what we anticipate could happen. And we're going to share with you some of the options that we're lining up and some of the responses that we think that we'll be able to offer to you. And then we also want to list some things for you to think about. So we really encourage you to talk with people that you trust, whether those friends, family, profs, staff, whomever you feel comfortable talking to, because we recognize a lot of you will be excited about exchange and we've been planning for this for a while, but we also recognize that certainly when you started at Queen's, you won't have been anticipating going abroad during a pandemic. So it's okay to ask questions, it's okay to be a little bit nervous, and to want to just kind of think things through. And then we'll also be looking at what your next steps are after this town hall. So first of all, I do just want to say congratulations. We had a lot of people apply to the exchange program and not everyone got placed. So congratulations to you who are on the call. You did it, and that is an achievement. We actually changed the application process for this year, and it was a good change. We feel maybe a little bit more rigorous, but we're really happy with the applications that we got, and you should be too, because your application was good and it meant that you got placed. So for the upcoming cycle, we work kind of a year in advance. So 2021, 22, or half a year in advance. We have 311 students going on exchange to 62 host countries or host universities in 22 countries. And so that is a little bit more than we sometimes send. The majority of students will be going out or planning to go out in the winter of 2022, with just over 80 starting their exchange in the fall of 2021. And so, yeah, we're excited for you, and we know that particularly for those folks who are maybe going out in the fall, that some of these issues are a little bit more pressing. At this moment, we are optimistic that the fall will be running and that winter will be, but particularly in the last year, this is kind of a big caveat that this can change. So we're just trying to explain what the risks are and the responses we have so that you can make an informed decision about choosing to participate in the program. We want to give you this information before you accept your offer, just so you feel that you have been informed. And this isn't the only opportunity you'll have to get information. There's information on the information sheet. You can sign up for an advising session, and there will be an orientation program as well. So just to provide a little bit of context and to maybe kind of share the reality of what we've been dealing with. Over a year ago, we suspended the full year exchanges that were kind of halfway through, and winter 2020 exchanges in China. That was before the full extent of the pandemic really became obvious. And then in March, we recalled all full year and winter 2020 students who were abroad. And then in May 2020, we made the decision to suspend fall 2020 and full year. And then in October, we made the decision to cancel the winter 2021 exchange program. So you'll see that where possible, we are trying to make decisions about the next semester in as far as advanced as possible. But because things change so quickly, it's not always possible to make kind of snap decisions. We know that certainty and having definite answers is the preference. Unfortunately, the reality is at the moment that we're just at a stage where the information changes on a daily basis almost. So we're just trying to give you as much information as we can. So like I said, we're currently planning on delivering the exchange program in fall 2021 and winter 2022. But there is this big caveat, like I was saying, that this may not happen just because of the unpredictable nature of the pandemic. And we do look at what's going on nationally, globally, by listening to what our partners are telling us, listening to what International SOS is telling us. We've partnered with them to provide safety information and safety services. And we'll always make decisions that we feel prioritize student welfare and safety. And that is the kind of the trump card that tops everything. And we recognize that suspending an exchange program can interfere with academics. And again, that's why we're trying to be as proactive as possible. The good news and the reality is that even when we had the students who were on exchange this time last year and they're recalled, the students who came back, the majority of them were able to complete a full semester's, were able to complete a full semester load of courses, so they weren't actually academically disadvantaged. There's a great question from Paige in the chat. Would an exchange being suspended be an exchange being fully cancelled? Essentially, yes, the terminology that we use is suspended because there is a possibility that we would make a different decision for the winter and for future. but typically when we say suspended, that does mean that it would be cancelled. So that's a terminology thing. So thanks, Paige, for asking that question. So when I'm talking about suspension, I'm talking about an exchange not happening, i.e. being cancelled. So your exchange could be disrupted by any of the following, and this isn't an exhaustive list. Like I said, it's kind of based on what we've already seen happening over the past or year and a bit, and what partners are advising us on as well. So some of these things may happen to you. It may be it happens to a group of students or all students. We will be here to support all of you as well as we are able. Like I said, we were able to make sure in winter of 2020 that all the students who left their exchange programs were able to finish the semester, so they weren't, the vast majority were not academically impacted, but we will support you in finding a plan through, and we work with Arts and Science, the faculty office there, to support you as well. So just to kind of go through a few things, we take our cue quite heavily from what Global Affairs Calendar is saying, although that is not the only source, like I was saying. And even if Global Affairs Calendar does make a certain determination, and exchanges can run, like we were saying, things can change pretty quickly. So depending on where you are in the world and the decisions that the government of the host country you're in, depending on decisions that they make, you may not be able, and depending where you are located at the moment in the world, you may not be able to get your study permit if processing centers close down quickly, or you may not be able to get a language test result. And also, you know, if borders close, that can happen pretty quickly, like we've seen in different countries, and that can kind of happen overnight with little warning. And then there may also be kind of unanticipated costs, such as flights being disrupted due to changing airline services. So there are quite a few risks. Risk in itself is not a bad thing, but risk is something that you need to be aware of so that you can assess kind of where your comfort level is, right? So some people are going to have a really high risk tolerance and be like, yep, that's okay. I'm kind of mentally prepared for all this, and you know, and that's okay. And there may be some of you for whom, you know, the idea of having to you know, make decisions quickly when you're maybe in a culture that you're not familiar with, where you maybe don't have access to the resources you have, that just may not be something that you're interested in, and that's totally okay. And we also recognize as well that there is, you know, for some people, that is going to be based on kind of their financial situation as well. So some people are going to be able to kind of make changes to flights pretty quickly because, you know, they have more, they have a greater cash flow. For other people, that's not going to be the reality. So we recognize that that's the situation that some of you are going to be experiencing as well. Just a question from Jordan: can a full year exchange be suspended for just a full term and still run in the winter? I think we'll get to that in just a few slides time when we kind of explain what the options are, but that's a great question, Jordan. So just a few other things to kind of think about. You know, you may have difficulty obtaining essential products and services. So yeah, depending on, you know, if you're in a country and there's a kind of a sudden lockdown, that may prevent you accessing certain services. There may be areas of the world where there are spikes in COVID, or maybe, you know, the pandemic is having a disproportionate effect. So you may increase your risk of exposure. And of course, depending on what services are available and transportation, and you know, if there's any lockdown and stay-at-home orders, that could impact your ability to access consular services. So actually, when you go through OCASP, you'll be asked to kind of identify what the local consul is, and they do typically have email and phone numbers as well, but just to be aware that accessing them physically may be difficult. And then there may be, like I was saying, kind of those lockdown and stay-at-home orders are pretty strict. For example, in Australia, in Victoria and some places, they find 3 people who have COVID, and suddenly there's a lockdown for a week, and they don't. It's not been like Ontario, where they tell you that the lockdown is coming in 4 days' time. It's as of midnight of that day. So different countries are handling it differently. And then also, depending on your situation, you may find it more difficult to find health and travel insurance that covers COVID-19 and your particular situation. So with all that being said, risks, like I said, are not a bad thing. And some of these things are, things that we're going to have to, probably be trying to navigate in, for a while to come. And even if courses were being offered on main campus in person. So it's not to say necessarily the exchange program per se is more risky, but just that there are a lot of variables just depending on the part of the world that you're going to. So that's the decision that you have to make. And we're not trying to say don't go, because that's absolutely not what we're saying. We're just trying to get you to think about kind of, what situations you might find yourself in and what your comfort level is, like I was saying. So you do, if you accept your offer, you are voluntarily assuming all the risks associated with the decision to travel, including those outlined above. That's not an exhaustive list. Like, there's no way that we can list every risk, but you do acknowledge that there is a certain amount of risk by accepting the offer. So in looking at the possible responses to disruptions, there are certain limitations. So we may not be able to provide all options to each student. And options are dependent on many variables. So for example, a fourth-year student can't study abroad in fall 2022 if that's the final term of their degree program, but a second-year student may be able to, as 2022 is still within their typical 4 years of study. Options are also time sensitive because of external deadlines, which can vary from partner to partner and other factors. And not all options will be available for every disruption that's been previously listed. So again, a heavy dose of caveats and asterisks flying all over the place. So in the event of a host university suspension, we'll be informed by the partner of the suspension, and the IPO will contact you to let you know kind of what your options are. In most circumstances, you'll be given 2 weeks to make an informed decision, because we don't want you to kind of rush into that. And we'll try and give you as much information as possible, relevant information to your situation at the time of suspension. And again, that information may vary across by host university and by student. So Miriam's just asking, did you say that a fourth-year student can't go on exchange in fall 2021, or did you mean winter 2022? So, so for example, if there was a student who was going on exchange in fall 2021 and that got cancelled and they wanted to just defer for a year to fall 2022, that's an example of where they wouldn't be able to do that, because then that student would be in the oh, I see what you mean about being in the final term of yeah, I see what you mean, Miriam. That's a good point. So yeah, Haley.
Hi, if I can, I think I grasp what Miriam is asking, because we have a number of students who are in fourth year currently in a fall term exchange. So I think what Miriam might be asking is, if that fall term exchange is canceled and they're already in their final year, could they defer to a winter term, which would be the final term? And we'll be discussing that in the responses in just a moment, that's typically not an option. because that would be the final term of a degree. And that's typically when students aren't able to study abroad on exchange, as they're required to complete their final credits at Queen's. So we're going to dive into those responses in a little more detail soon to kind of lay out what the options are, because there's more than one response that we have prepared. So I hope that was okay. I jumped in, Tom. I think that was my interpretation of the question.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Hayley, and thanks, Miriam. And sorry, folks, for any confusion. Hopefully that's cleared up. So for the possible responses to disruptions, so and again, with the caveat that not all options are going to be available to all students, you can request an alternative placement. You may be able to defer or reduce your placement at the host university. And then you may be able to participate on a virtual exchange at the host university. And the last option, obviously, is withdrawing from exchange and reapplying to the 2022-23 program, if you think that you're in a position to do that. So I think that, Jordan, that we'll also be talking about, I think the situation you were asking about in terms of full year exchanges. But I think, Hayley, if you want to kind of delve into the specifics of the different options, that'd be great.
Of course, thanks, Tom. Okay, so now that we have kind of an overview of how COVID-19 is impacting exchange, we can talk in a little more detail about what these responses are. And as Tom said earlier, we have had a year of working with student mobility and the COVID-19 pandemic. So we've been able to develop these types of responses through some of the experiences that Tom laid out earlier in the presentation of former suspensions. So one of the responses that we'll provide a student if they experience a disruption, and the most common disruptions that we have seen in the past year have been a host university suspension, or when Queen's University has made the decision to suspend exchanges. So one of the most common options we'll provide is the alternative placement option. We will offer alternative placements at partner universities that still have space at the time that a student may experience a suspension. We are limited to when we can offer these alternative placements, however, because our partners have external deadlines that we have to meet. So depending on the time of year and the time of the exchange cycle we're in, we might be a bit limited in whether we can provide this as an option. We would provide students, as Tom said, with about 2 weeks, so it is a short period of time to make an informed decision, but we would give them lots of information and support as they're making that decision. And all placement decisions are made, as always, in accordance with application scores, which is exactly how you were placed on the program to begin with. Available spaces and places when it comes to alternative placements can change on a weekly basis. This is a fluid process. So if a student has experienced a host university suspension for a fall term, let's say in February this month, and a student experiences a host university suspension in March a month later for fall term, let's say, there would be different options available for alternative placements, because we're moving with students to try to move them around in the program so they can continue on with exchange, and that's always our goal. Students, of course, as I mentioned, would be responsible if they choose to engage with an alternative placement option with doing their own independent research on a partner to determine if academically, financially, and personally, the alternative partner is a suitable choice for them. And in particular, we would want students to consider the situation of COVID in that particular community. And unfortunately, we can't guarantee that every student will receive an alternative placement. We are limited, again, by things like external deadlines and also eligibility requirements. So these external variables set by our partners. And we can only offer one alternative placement to each student. We're working with a couple hundred students, and we want to try to provide everyone with an opportunity to study abroad, which is why we have multiple responses that we've built over the last year. But we are limited to providing one alternative placement. So if a student has an alternative placement after experiencing an original host university suspension, and then that alternative placement is suspended, they could then consider one of our other options if those are feasible at the time, which I'll talk about in a moment. And finally, and really importantly, it's not mandatory for a student to request an alternative placement. Say they experience a host university suspension and decide that that's that, and they're not wanting to continue in the program. That is completely okay, and we'll support the student's decision and help them transition back to Queen's. So this is an optional response that you can choose to engage with should you find yourself in a situation where it's made available to you. And I've noticed a question pop into the chat. If it's okay with everyone, I'll answer that towards the end, just so we can capture them. So you can put questions in the chat as we go, and we'll have a time for some Q&As or questions and answers at the end. Tom, could we go to the next slide, please? Thank you. All right, so our second response to a possible disruption is a deferred or reduced placement. And I just want to say before diving into the description of this option that if a student is to experience a suspension, we'll provide them with a lot of information, and we're available to meet with them if they have questions about the information we've provided. So please don't feel the need to be scribbling this down in a notebook or trying to remember everything you're hearing tonight, because if you find yourself in a situation where these responses are made available, you'll have plenty of support and an opportunity to review that information when it's most relevant to you. So a deferred or reduced placement is what Jordan was kind of asking about earlier. If you are on a full year exchange and experience a suspension, then you would look to a reduced placement, meaning you would shorten that full year exchange to 1 semester, most likely the winter 2022 semester. If you were on a fall term exchange and experienced a suspension, then you would be looking to defer your exchange by 1 term to the winter 2022 term. So we can offer a deferred or reduced placement for a student if the host university agrees. That's really important because we work in reciprocal partnerships with these universities. So we would have to find that out before we could confirm that option. If a host university cannot defer or reduce an exchange, then this option is not available. And just like alternative placements, if this option isn't available, we would look to our other responses to try and support the student. And it may take some time to hear from partner universities regarding deferrals or reduction agreements, because exchange offices are always usually busy places, but a little more busy trying to work through student mobility in the midst of a pandemic. It's definitely a new experience. And one thing that's really important to think about when you are thinking about this particular response is how an academic progression in a degree plan could be impacted by a deferred placement particularly. So students who are in 4th year, as mentioned earlier, are required to spend their final term at Queen's and not on the exchange program. So if we're looking at a fall deferral to winter 2022, that's an important thing to consider when thinking about those responses. Excuse me, and we would advise that you would work with the IPO if you find yourself in that situation, so we could find the most suitable choice for you personally and academically. And if in considering this particular option, we would encourage students, I should say, to consult with their undergraduate chairs in their home departments, as those units can provide academic advising on degree progression. Okay, and can we go to the next slide, please, Tom? Thank you. So something that is a bit new is our third response, which is a possibility of a virtual exchange. This is something that we're starting to see pop up in some of our partner universities. And we've seen some really interesting and innovative programming on this front. So if a student's in-person exchange is suspended and their host university is offering a virtual exchange experience, they may be able to participate in this opportunity. Please be advised that all virtual exchange opportunities may be synchronous, which means that they may be offered in that time zone of the host university. So that could mean that attending classes or doing group work is actually happening in a different time zone. And that's an important thing that we've noted with some of this virtual exchange programming. And that would be my #1 question if a student was considering this option, and something that the IPO can help students look into. So virtual exchange for that reason or others may not be an option for all students, but it also may not be an option that's provided by the host university. So it may not be a personal choice for some students, but it also may not be an actual logistic choice for some students if the host university isn't presenting this as an option. And one thing I'll note about virtual exchanges is this is a fairly new and innovative way to study abroad and have mobility. Mobility we often think of as being in person, and it's that physical movement. However, there's lots of ways to think about student exchange and student mobility, and it can be about very much the movement of ideas and thoughts, and that's important as well. And so we're starting to see that populate in some of our partners programming, which is really, really interesting. Okay, and on to our final response, please, Tom. So our final response, of course, is that a student can withdraw from exchange. We really want to stress that it is completely okay to withdraw from the exchange program. We have students who will withdraw one business day after accepting an offer, and we might have a student withdraw the day before that their plane is meant to depart. You can withdraw from the exchange program at any time, and you will receive support from Queen's. And there's certainly no shame in doing that. That's completely okay. Students who do choose to withdraw may be refunded the $200 program fee if the circumstances of the withdrawal aligns with the IPO's current policy. I'm going to just share this policy now so that we're all on the same page with it. The IPO will refund the exchange program fee in the following circumstances. Number one, if a student changes their mind for any reason within the first 30 days of providing proof of payment of the exchange program fee. The second is that Queen's or the host university suspends the exchange program. And the third is that the student is unable to participate in an exchange because of circumstances beyond their control relating to the COVID-19 pandemic. Next slide, please. So students the IPO will not be refunded or will not refund the program fee, however, for reasons that could have reasonably been anticipated or after the 30 days that I previously mentioned have elapsed, the above points notwithstanding. And the IPO, of course, will also consider refunds on a case-by-case basis. So if you're in doubt if you should be receiving a refund or not, you can always email ipo@queensu.ca, and we can certainly help clarify that. And I know that was a lot of information just about a refund, but just rest assured that you can always reference that in our COVID-19 and exchange information sheet, and you can always follow up with us if you have questions. Okay, next slide, please. So just a couple other notes on this final option of withdrawing and reapplying, and this is particularly about the reapplying part of this response. Students may reapply to the 2022-23 program as an upper year student. So if you are in third year and you will be completing 4 years at Queen's, you may have this option. Please note there are additional application requirements for upper year students, however. So you would have to go through a few extra supporting documents with an application if you were to withdraw and reapply, which really isn't too much work, and the IPO can certainly help you out with that. It's also very important that students think about their academic progression if they are considering this option of withdrawing and reapplying. So again, as a reminder, students are required to spend their final term at Queen's, not on the exchange program. We should note as well that studying abroad in fourth year can be challenging for some degree programs in particular because of particular course requirements that take place in that final year. But also because there's lots of things that happen in that final fourth year that might not be happening earlier on in a degree. So for instance, students might be applying to graduate school, law school, or medical school, and they should think about those responsibilities and those opportunities when they consider whether this is an option. And then, of course, departments are always on hand to provide academic advising on the degree plan progression question. Thanks. Next slide, please, Tom. So a question you might be having is, what are my options if I don't experience a disruption or suspension? And apologies if that's already been asked in the chat. So of course, if you aren't experiencing a disruption or a suspension, you can always withdraw, like mentioned, by emailing ipo@queensu.ca, and we'll reply in a prompt manner, and we'll give you lots of kind of guidance on what comes next and or answer any questions you have about that process. You may be eligible to receive the program fee refund if you meet the requirements of the IPO's refund policy. And you can certainly reapply for the 2022-23 exchange program, but that would be as an upper year student, and students would need to consider, again, where they are in their degree plan before they know if that's an option. Next slide, please. Okay, so there's some additional considerations for reapplying for a 2022-23 exchange. It is possible that we may have students from previous cohorts apply for the 2022-23 program. We did see that this year, and because we've had these kind of cascading suspensions, depending on what the upcoming year brings, that could be a possibility. If this occurs, then we're likely going to see an increase in the size of the applicant pool. So upon considering reapplying, that's one factor to keep in mind. Of course, we will develop an application process that is fair, but also does accommodate any potential increase in applications and program capacity. And of course, our deadline for exchange never shifts. It's always early January 2022. And we will not be able to accept late applications. That is a standard policy in the office. Some other considerations would be we may have less space than usual at our partner universities in future cycles. We cannot, unfortunately, guarantee that future cycles won't be impacted by the pandemic or won't be impacted by other global events. And bursaries, if students are holding exchange bursaries this year, are not deferrable. So should a student withdraw and choose to reapply, they would be also reapplying for that bursary. Next slide, please. All right, so that hopefully captures kind of our response summary and gives you a bit of insight there. Again, as I mentioned, because that was a lot of very particular information, there's no need for you to retain all of that immediately. You'll receive a recording of this webinar. You'll also be able to refer to your information sheet, which has this information presented in a different format. So now let's shift gears a little bit and talk about preparing for studying abroad during COVID-19. So as Tom mentioned earlier, we really want you to think about your risk tolerance and your comfort level for studying abroad during a pandemic, and knowing that there is still some uncertainty as to what this looks like and how this pandemic will continue to roll out and hopefully wrap up in different places around the world. So as Tom mentioned, have that critical kind of conversation with yourself, but also talk about this with folks that you trust, and know that you can certainly come to the IPO if you have questions about ways that we can support you while on the program. That's definitely an option as well, because it's not probably a black or white kind of thing where it's yes I go or no I can't. There's probably lots of great questions there, and like, I really want to study abroad on this program, but I'm worried that this might happen. So how could I be supported if that's the case, or how could I prepare? And we certainly want to help you address some of those questions. Another thing that you can do is start to prepare yourself for a possible or potential exchange disruption or suspension. So that could be just mentally at this stage. That also could be financially, starting to, as Tom mentioned, think about what the costs are, what your budget might be for participating on a program like this. And if there will be, a little bit of saving or planning around possibly needing to have some unanticipated expenses. So having some of these thoughts about your risk tolerance, your comfort level, thinking about some of the disruptions we mentioned, they're going to help you start to think about how you're going to approach this really fantastic program at quite an unusual time in our history. Also, what's really important, and what you'll hear about if you do accept your offer and attend our safety town hall in a few weeks, is thinking about your health insurance, your health and travel insurance. It's not too late to start thinking about that, and we did post some information in the COVID-19 and exchange information sheet about questions that you should be asking about your health and your travel insurance regarding COVID-19. You should also ensure that any purchases are covered by cancellation insurance and or are refundable. And I just want to say at this point in time, nobody should be making any major purchases when it comes to exchange. The IPO's typical kind of benchmark for making big purchases is after acceptance to the host university. So we still have several steps to go through together before we actually get to this stage. It's a bit early on, but it's always important to think about. And finally, one thing that we would encourage you to reflect on is, the reality that this likely would not be a traditional exchange that you might have seen others partake in. So as Tom indicated, there could be some restrictions on social activities, classes, travel opportunities. There is likely going to be quarantine requirements, although that could really vary around the world and over the course of a year. Culture shock could be intensified, particularly if there are quarantine requirements. That adjustment period can be difficult when everything goes smoothly, but if there are bumps in the road, it's important to start thinking about strategies for trying to make that cultural adjustment as smooth as possible. And again, that's something that the IPO and your host university can help you out with. And finally, there is a possibility that you could be recalled during exchange. Again, hopefully that possibility shrinks and shrinks as we go on, but COVID-19 is very different around the world, as Tom has indicated, so it's important to keep that in mind, particularly when you were thinking about what this experience could look like. Next slide, please. Okay, so what happens next? Oh, sorry, can we go? Perfect. Okay, so we're going to talk about what happens next. Again, you will get a copy of this PowerPoint tomorrow, but you're very welcome to take a photo of the screen if you'd like, because this is a nice little checklist of the next couple of weeks. So once we go through this checklist, then we will turn over and look at some of the questions that you've asked about the COVID-19 aspect of our presentation today. So what happens next? Tomorrow, you will receive a follow-up email that has the webinar recording and also probably your information sheet attached again. And then we would encourage you to speak, if you haven't already, or if you aren't going to tonight or wherever you are in the world this morning or the afternoon, speak with those you trust about the opportunity ahead of you before you accept or decline your offer. And then you will need to make your decision of accepting or declining your offer by March 5th. That is next Friday. After you accept or decline, if you choose to accept, you'll receive a next steps email from the IPO that will either be on March 8th or 9th, and that's going to outline some of the following. So for fall and full year students, you'll join us for an academic orientation. There will be 2. You only have to attend 1. They'll be on either March 12th or March 18th. Everyone is encouraged to attend the off-campus activity safety policy town hall, which is scheduled for March 13th. And of course, all of these sessions will be virtual. Just a quick note, because it's been mentioned a few times, the off-campus activity safety policy is a required part of any exchange student's pre-departure journey. So it is a safety module and risk assessment that students complete all about their host country and their host community. So it's a great way for you to get informed about the community that you're going into and the various kinds of risks and steps you can take to reduce risk. So there's going to be a town hall about that in a couple of weeks where there'll be a lot of information shared about studying abroad safely during the pandemic. And then there will be our famous Exchange Connect to Date. Michael and I are working on that this week, so there's more information to follow. This will be a virtual event. It's a social one for fall and full year students, where you can get to know each other. You can talk with other students who've studied abroad and kind of get that really important student perspective on the exchange program. And finally, you will begin your host university application once you hear from the IPO. So we will be nominating students at various stages over the next couple of weeks and months for fall and full year exchange. And after we do that internal nomination process, we reach out and provide instructions on how to apply to the to the host university. So that's not anything that you need to be super worried about, because it's something that we're going to prompt you to do. Winter term students, you have a slightly different path. It's a little longer. You were also encouraged to attend the OCAST Town Hall on March 13th, but you will not begin any of the other pre-departure planning until August and September. So you can actually sit back, relax, periodically check your emails over the summer in case you get any important updates from our office. Okay, next slide, please. So we just wanted to provide you with a few additional resources, and we've mentioned these in varying capacities today. You can have an advising session with the IPO, and there's our bit.ly link there to do so. You can have an advising session with your undergraduate chairs if you have questions about academic progression, either in terms of deciding whether you want to accept or decline your offer, but also you're going to be able to do this if you do find yourself in a situation where you'll be utilizing one of our responses to COVID-19. International SOS is the third-party service that Queen's is a member of that Tom mentioned earlier. So you can access their online portal and get all sorts of fantastic information about your host community and different safety elements there. So you can click on that link, and using your Queen's login, you can check that out at any time. If you have specific questions about safety abroad, about insurance, you can contact the off-campus activity safety policy coordinator, Sandra Jeffers, and there's her email. And she will be coordinating and leading the town hall in a few weeks. And finally, if any of the information that we've shared tonight has been triggering or really worrisome, you can certainly contact Student Wellness Services. There's some fantastic supports available to all students there. And of course, you can reach out to us if you'd like a referral, or if you just want to have a more in-depth conversation about anything you heard this evening at the session. And on that note, I think we have quite a few questions from folks. So if we could go to the next slide. And Tom, if you don't mind joining me, and Michael as well, maybe we can now answer some of these good questions. Michael, do you mind reading? Oh, sorry, Tom, no worries.
Yeah, I'll read some questions out here for you to answer. So the first question I'll answer from the bottom up is from a student who's asking, do you know approximately when winter 2022 students will need to apply to host universities?
Well, I can answer that one. That won't be for quite a while. The earliest applications for winter 2022 are typically due by mid-August. So students can start to hear from the IPO, and usually early August is enough time to get those applications in.
Perfect. So we have two questions that are around academics and getting advising around them. So we have one question saying, if you are worried about course selection abroad, is it better to speak with an IPO advisor, a faculty advisor? And another student saying, in regard to academics, where do we find what courses would be equivalent to the ones necessary in our degrees, or who would we contact about this?
Yeah, those are fantastic questions. Thanks, everyone. I think in terms of the first question, it's really dependent on the questions that you have. So if you have questions about the number of courses that you might be taking at your host university, or how to find information from a host university, then those are more exchange-based questions, and I would recommend you contact our team so we can help you with that. If your questions are specific to your degree program requirements or how you're progressing through your degree, then your undergraduate chair is the best person that you can speak with, and you'll be able to contact them by doing a Google search of your home department. So for instance, the School of Computing, and finding their contact information there. And if ever in doubt, you can reach out to our team, and we're happy to put you in touch with the correct person. And Michael, this second question, can you refresh me on that?
Yeah, so it was just also related to academics and whether or not someone would make an appointment with the IPO or with their faculty advisor.
Okay, so I think I just answered that one.
I'm going to scroll up to some of the earlier questions here.
I'm happy to jump in here. So there was a question, when would we know if a host university decided to not allow international students? That's a great question, and it varies by institution. What we've seen in the past, though, is that typically universities within particular countries or regions tend to make decisions around the same time. So we have already had some of our partners in Australia and New Zealand cancel the fall, and we anticipate that there could be additional cancellations. But it's really a case of when we find out that information from the host institution, we'll let you know as soon as possible. There's another great question: what happens to living expenses if exchange becomes suspended while we are there? Are we able to stay there if we're on off-campus housing, or do we have to come back immediately? So just to provide some context, and I think there's another question relating to this. When we recalled students, we didn't make that mandatory in winter 2020. We recognize that for some students, based on various circumstances, that they may prefer to stay in location. And so we didn't make it mandatory for students to return to Canada or their home country. I can't speak with 100% certainty what we would do in the future, but it's likely that we would do something similar. The thing that I do want to note that has been mentioned in the information sheet, but I don't think we've addressed specifically this evening, is that, I just want to make sure I get the wording right on this, is that if you do participate in exchange, you'll be required to assume all anticipated and unanticipated travel related costs associated with your exchange. So this can include, but isn't limited to, things like vaccination, quarantine, any testing costs incurred prior to travel or when you arrive in your host country, and or upon return to Canada or your home country, things like flight changes, early termination of rental leases, or financial costs associated with travel notices that are issued by the Canadian government or others. So that's why we were talking about we recognise that different students will find themselves in different financial situations. We will always help provide emergency support, but in terms of the university, paying for students to return home, that is not something that the university has committed to. And if you accept your exchange, that's with the understanding that you're assuming those anticipated and unanticipated costs. Are you able to stay there if there's off-campus housing, or do we have to come home immediately? Like I said, in winter 2020, we left it up to students to make the decision that they felt meant that they were safest. There's another great question. What if we withdraw due to extenuating circumstances? I think that was about the refund program fee. Yeah, extenuating circumstances, if you break your leg and you're not able to fly anywhere and you withdraw from exchange, then absolutely. Or perhaps there's an event in the family that prevents you and you want to withdraw, absolutely. We try to be as flexible as possible with issuing refunds, particularly at the moment, because we know that finances are strained as a result of the pandemic. We want to be as flexible as possible, but we're also trying to put up some kind of red lines, because we do put a lot of work into the exchange program, and the fees that students pay do help us run the program. So we just ask that students be mindful of when they're asking for refunds. And then the last one, maybe, or last couple that I'll jump in, then maybe I can hand back to Michael. Sorry, Michael. If the exchange is cancelled, is it two-way or one-way? If the country that exchange is safe, but Queen's may be risky to exchange, will the exchange be successful? What we've done in the past is if Queen's cancels and we don't send students out, then we don't take students in. There could be situations, where some countries are cancelling, but overall we are still sending students out. So again, it kind of depends on the situation. But if we cancel the program, then that does mean that we are not sending students out on exchange. And maybe at this point I'll hand back to Michael and you can stop hearing my voice.
Oh, thank you for that, Tom. One of the questions that have come up a while is if you're currently planning for exchange in the fall If exchange is suspended, would you be able to participate in an alternative winter exchange if you're able to satisfy all degree requirements? How do things factor in if you're also in fourth year in that kind of situation? And I think just to say a little bit related to that, tonight we went over some of the possible options that may be extended to you in a possible suspension, but not every option is going to be available for every situation. And so we're going to be working closely with you to find the right fit to see if we can still get an international experience for you, but that may not always be the case. But again, it's always working one-on-one to try to see what works in that particular situation. One of the next questions we do see here is, do you know what, in regards to the, sorry, I'm looking at the questions here that are coming through and just trying to see if I can group any of them together. Some people are asking about the next step of applying to a host university. And some of the questions are revolving around the idea of, is there any chance that you will not get accepted to your host university? And does accepting your offer right now mean you're immediately jumping into an application to a host university? Taylor, do you want to speak to that a little?
Sure. Thank you for the question. It's a good one. There's always a possibility that a student is not going to be accepted, but that chance is very minimal because the IPO has done a thorough vetting of every student's record to ensure that eligibility requirements are met. One consideration that we've seen come through from partners is that there is possibility of reduced capacity that could be on their campuses. So that could be in classes, in residence. So that is something that we're kind of keeping on our radar and could be something that actualizes into a situation. And if that were the case, we would support a student in that situation if they were no longer to accept a student. So that also could be a reason for potentially a decline. We haven't seen that occur yet. But it's something that I think everyone is just being very cautious of, and the partners are keeping really good communication with us. So that's a great sign. And the second part of that question was about whether students need to jump into host university applications right now. And the answer is no. Please don't jump into any host university applications until you are prompted by our office to do so. And in the documents we sent you last week, we provided a bit of a timeline for when that will occur. So for fall and full year students, you're going to hear from us anytime beginning now until probably May would be the last time. And for winter term students, you should start keeping an eye out for those emails beginning in August and then going into possibly October. So hopefully that helps answer your question.
Perfect. One question that has resurfaced is about academics. And the student is wondering where they would be able to find / understand courses and how they're equivalent to ones that are necessary for the completion of their degree, or who should they be contacting? And just to speak to this previously, part of the exchange program is that during your orientation and when we release some more documents to you, this process will become really clear. We have an established forum for you to communicate with departments and get assessments of courses. We all know that courses change from year to year, and Queen's doesn't even have its next year's courses out at this moment. So it might take a little while. There's not a lot that you can immediately do in terms of that, but we'll always be making sure that you have the resources to know that you're doing this comfortably in a way that you're feeling secure in it. There's a question about last year's experiences, and a student is asking, when programs were canceled last year, were students refunded the residence fees that were already paid to a host university?
So that's a good question. And for the most part, students, there are refund policies that were set by the host universities that meant that the majority of students had any residence fees that were that they had paid and they wouldn't be using were returned. Like I was saying, the situation, and that we would hope that would be the situation in any future year as well, that there would be flexibility from our host partners. We would always try and support that as well. So there were sometimes, you know, when we contacted the host institution just to kind of clarify what the situation was and advocate for you, we definitely would do that. in that situation. Like I said, for future exchanges, just be aware that the current situation is that we would expect students to be kind of absorb unanticipated costs. So that is just something to kind of factor in.
One of the next questions here is related to applying and the timeline of things. And it's just saying, for winter term exchanges, when do host universities typically send out acceptances? So if you're thinking about a winter 22 exchange, as Haley was mentioning, the timeline's a little bit later for you. And so you're going to be doing a lot of your pre-departure preparations in the fall. So if you're seeing people getting putting their applications in, working through the process, it's most likely those students are heading out in the fall itself. And so don't feel like you're falling behind in your own preparations. We're always going to prompt you for those next steps. And so don't measure yourself against other students maybe going to different universities. Measure yourself on your own timeline that we'll outline and is outlined on your fact sheets, and we'll make sure you have that information. It will never be a surprise. The questions here was asked a little bit earlier. And so if we are able to, a student is asking, would they be able to apply to courses that are taking place in the term that they're going on exchange here at Queen's? Just in case. And that was one of the questions asked a bit earlier.
Okay, so Michael, is the question asking, can students enroll in Queen's courses during their term when they're supposed to be abroad on the program?
Absolutely, and specifically the student was asking to anticipate possible suspensions.
Sure, that's a good question. Tom, do you want to answer that question, or would you like me to address that question?
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in, and it is a really good question. It's something that typically wouldn't happen, but we recognize that there is some uncertainty. So we're going to be talking with the Office of the University Registrar about the possibility of students registering and then putting on what we call the exchange block. This is a 15-unit block for a semester-long exchange, putting that onto your Solus account a little bit later. So we will definitely send all of you an update, especially for those of you going out in the fall. But we'll send you an update when we have more information. But yeah, like we said, I mean, the decision about suspension is the primary focus is your welfare, but we also know that your academic progression is really important, and that you don't want to be kind of left without access to courses. So we will be addressing that shortly.
So the questions are winding down. Someone was just saying thank you. There is a question here that was just saying they were just asking the earlier question about when they would hear back from the host university. And they were just saying that question was more about booking flights. And that just reiterates a really important point that our office makes often, and advice that we make to not book flights until you have official acceptances and things down the line. So patience is always key when working through the process that is exchange planning. And so this is just the first step of a long journey.
Yeah. Just to add on to that, I mean, we would hope to make, like I said, if you remember that table right from the beginning about when we made decisions about the next semester, we're going to try and make a decision as far enough in advance for you as possible. But then it does come back to that risk thing. So, once you've got your offer from your host university, you've accepted it in kind of quote unquote normal years, that could be a trigger for when you start to kind of make purchases. But because we don't know how things are going to change, you do have to kind of ask yourself kind of, are you, when do you want to make those purchases? Are you, do you want to wait a little bit longer and maybe prices will go down, but then prices could also go up. And so that's why Haley was mentioning about looking at the terms of your insurance, about refund policies. So you've really got to be sure about what you're signing up for, because a flight that could look really good but has a bad, like, no change options, and then you need to change that later, that could actually be more expensive in the long run. So I know, Rachel, that's a bit of a grey answer, but we just want to be kind of as honest as possible.
Great. And the last question here is, when do people normally start looking into houses and residence? As Tom was mentioning, it is a lot rated to risk levels, things looking out into the future. It also has a lot to do with when you're doing your pre-departure preparations. So when a host university extends an acceptance towards you, they usually extend some information regarding housing in a particular city or how it looks at their particular university. So it's going to look a little bit different around the world just because systems look different, different institutions, different countries. And so there's some information usually on fact sheets that you can look at to try to anticipate what it looks like for your particular situation. But it's also part of the pre-departure preparation. So do know people will be doing it at different times.
I think there was a question as well that maybe Michael, you'd asked maybe a little bit of clarification, but are alternative options for subsequent terms available due to suspensions, or are extenuating circumstances also considered? I would say that if you think you are in an extenuating circumstance, the easiest thing is just contact us at the IPO and kind of explain what your situation is, and obviously you can share with us as much or as little as possible. I mean, obviously the more information we have, you know, the more understanding we'll have, but we also recognize that there may be some privacy concerns, or you may not wish to disclose that, and that's absolutely up to you. So if you think that you are in a situation like that, probably the easiest thing is to get in touch with us, and we can talk to you about what your specific situation will look like.
Thank you everyone for participating this evening and joining us for this town hall. If you do have any last questions, please put them in the chat, but otherwise I see people are filing out of the chat here. And everyone who's saying thank you for joining us.